Yes, hello again to all of my Vintage Dirt Bike subscribers, and thanks once more for tuning into the last and final episode of the Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show 2022 videos, where we take a look at the last selection of old classic dirt bikes. So just to get things underway, we're going to head off to the Greaves Riders Association stand to take a look at a couple of very special classics. Now, this first machine that we're looking at is actually an old race bike that belonged to the late and great Brian Badger Goss, or Brian Winston Goss, to give him his official title. Now, Badger, as you know, was one of Britain's great scrambles racers, and some of the others like Alan Clough, Vic Eastwood, Dave Bickers, and many more were all solely responsible for keeping us all entertained during those long winter afternoons when in the 1960s the BBC would broadcast scrambles events live on TV in their BBC Grandstand sports programmes, when you could watch all the aforementioned Mr. Clough, Bickers, Goss and the rest of the guys tearing around on these old Greaves bikes at breakneck speed, of course right up to their armpits in deep sticky mud. Now, if I can still remember what I was told about this bike on the day at the show, it's a 1961 Greaves Challenger motocross special, and it is of course one of Badger Goss's old race bikes that's been given the full restoration treatment. And actually I was told also that Brian Goss wanted to buy this old bike back only weeks before he passed away in 2021, aged 80 years of age. Now, Badger Goss, as you know, was a former British and European champion, and as I said, he was certainly a scrambles legend as well when he was riding at his local club race events where he lived in the south of the country. So not only is this bike a lovely vintage classic, it also has that added prestige of being the great man's number 46 race bike, with of course lots of old school racing history behind it. Now, also in the early 1960s, Greaves were still using these Villiers two-stroke engines, although later they would begin manufacturing their own motors to power their scramblers and other types of road-going motorcycles that they built. And this old Brian Goss Greaves here still has its old Amal monoblock carburetor that was of course widely used on many British-built bikes from back in the day. But they were still a good, solid, easily tunable old carburetor from that period. Once again, no rear tailpipe on this motor, just a straight through big bore pipe that came straight from the cylinder to go underneath the engine. Now, the emission of a silencer and tailpipe on this bike was more than likely just to try and keep the overall weight of the bike down to a decent level. Now, you can also see that things like these footrests were just very basic bits of steel rod that were then bolted onto the bottom of the bike's subframe. Although these Villiers motors were still good enough to enable top riders like Badger Goss to attain some quite decent results while riding them on the track, and although this was still British engine technology of its day, there wasn't much in the way of an alternative, as of course the Japanese invasion was still about another decade away. Although you did still get a decent amount of performance from this two-stroke motor. Another Greaves trademark here once again was this leading link style front forks, where the dampers go up inside those fork legs, and this was quite a basic suspension layout for its day, and as you'd expect, it did have very limited travel, but the riders, including the great Badger could still make these things fly around the track. Although again, this was the suspension technology of its time, and you just had to make the most of what you had. And at the rear end of the bike, the suspension was much the same as the front. Very basic dampers with very little in the way of suspension travel. Now, this piece of apparatus here at the front of the swing arm was also very interesting, and certainly something I've never come across on a Greaves bike before. And that little tube that you can see sticking up from the swing arm is actually an oil reservoir for holding oil, as the chain had an oil lubrication system on this bike, whereby you then filled this little tube with oil, and then it flowed through the left side of the swing arm and then through a little distributor tube that then dripped oil onto the chain. So it was essentially a more ancient version of the kind of Scott oiler system that you would maybe fit to your old road bike. But it's a great idea, and I'll bet that it certainly helped extend the life of the chain. And here we have a set of period correct Greaves handlebars and controls on this historic machine. But these Greaves racers, of course, didn't have those cross handlebar strengtheners that you now tend to see on much more modern bikes. But a close-up here at the bike's frame identification number, which of course reads 24MDS146, which is in relation to Badger's number 46, which was his race number for many years. And also in the early 1960s, you can see that Greaves here were already using alloy frames on their scramblers, as this was their famous I-beam part of the bike's chassis. Although at the end of the day, this bike's owner has certainly done a great job of restoring this historic machine, and as I said prior to his passing, Badger did try and buy back his old number 46 race bike, but unfortunately he was unsuccessful. But hopefully this bike will now be kept as it is and be used as a lasting memory and legacy to the great man and all of the achievements that he gained while he was racing in what is now described as the golden days of British scrambling. But for me, it was certainly one of the star attractions at the show to be in the presence of and to just take a look at this superb historic racer. Now, staying with the Greaves Riders Association stand, we also had this lovely 1967 Greaves 360 Challenger, and this example here is currently owned by its club member, Ian Hodge. Now, Ian did tell me on the day that he bought this bike as a basket case, which was essentially just boxes and boxes of old Greaves parts that he bought from Mike Eadie, who was the former General Secretary of the GRA, or Greaves Riders Association. Now, the bike's previous owner, Mike Eadie's intention was to use all of the boxes of parts and its frame to try and fit a Triumph engine into the parts, but thankfully Ian then managed to talk him out of it and sold him all of the bits and pieces, which Ian then built this fantastic old Greaves classic from. And again, and as in the previous Badger Goss machine, this is one of the later 1967 Challengers, and you can see that the older banana style leading link suspension has now gone, and you now have a more conventional fork setup that's bolted on to the front of the bike. Now these old Challengers were still using old school drum brakes at this time, but this wasn't a heavy motorcycle, and these small drum brakes were still adequate stoppers if you wanted to either slow the bike down or pull it up a bit quick when you needed to stop. Now, since the Badger Goss days of the early 1960s, the rear suspension systems was marginally improved on these bikes with slightly better dampers on the rear. But in terms of today's high-tech suspension systems, these were still pretty basic units. But as I've said previously, this is what you had to work with in that 1960s period. And so as we move to the engine, in this particular Challenger here, we have a 360cc piston port two-stroke engine with those quite substantial cooling fins on the barrel. Now, some people say that Greaves designed these massive cooling fins on the cylinder as their intention was to try and sell these bikes in the USA, where desert racing was very popular at the time, and naturally building these big cooling fins into the motor would help dissipate the heat when these bikes were raced in hot environments. Although by all accounts these big Greaves motors were still quite a decent power plant for a 1967 British built race bike, and this Challenger engine of course had that twin port exhaust in the barrel, which had these two header pipes that slipped into a single tailpipe at the rear. But the exhaust layout on the later Griffin bikes would then be changed to an over the top of the engine type of configuration. And again, the gearboxes on these Challengers were a separate unit that simply bolted onto the rear of the engine's crankcases, and this was then of course connected through the clutch by the traditional primary chain. But as I remember, these 360s had a 5-speed gearbox and the usual wet multi-plate clutch. But when you see this 360 motor sitting in this alloy and tubular steel chassis, it certainly doesn't look anything like a 360 motor, but more like a bigger 500 or maybe even a 600 when you check out that huge fin area. But it's still a cracking looking bike, all painted in that now familiar British racing green colour. And once more, these old 1960s bikes used alloy mudguards on the front and rear. Not much plastic on this bike other than of course those front number plates, but another beautiful British racing classic. And as you know, just a couple of years later, these older Challenger models would then be changed for the newer Greaves Griffin bikes that would arrive on the scene in 1969. But it's thanks to the likes of Ian Hodge, who rescued this bike as just boxes of old Greaves bits and pieces, and then he spent many months restoring and refurbishing all the parts to end up with this fantastic looking motorcycle, and another fine example of one of these 1967 Greaves Challengers. And this bike here was so nice that racing legend Brian Wade couldn't even resist having his picture taken with it. And so as we continue our walk around the show, another one of the nice bikes that I did come across on my travels was this 1979 SWM RS 370. And again, this was another Italian SWM that was offered for sale on the day, and this bike here was going under the hammer for the princely sum of just £3,750. £150. Now, this particular SWM, or Speedy Working Motor as they were more commonly known, wasn't part of the very nice collection of SWMs that we featured from old Nobly's man Felipe in a recent video episode, but this was another private sale. But what a lovely machine this would make for enduro or classic racing, and actually the price on the day was what I thought was quite reasonable as well. And once more, and in most of the other cases with these SWMs, they're powered by this pretty awesome Rotax engine, and I'm sure you already know how good these two-stroke motors are when it comes to using them in off-road bikes. And they not only powered these SWM machines, but many others that were used for enduro or motocross racing. And so in that respect, it must certainly speak volumes about the reliability and suitability for these Rotax motors for use as an off-road engine. And if you're the owner of a bike that uses a similar 370 two-stroke engine, then you'll know exactly just how good these Rotax power plants are. But you have to agree, at first glance, looking at this SWM, you can see how the motor fits so snugly into that steel tube chassis. But it's certainly a fine looking bike, and it's had a decent job done on its restoration, because everything fitted to this bike looks just perfect and correct for its 1979 year. But this particular model of SWM here, as you can see, has quite long legs at the front, and these forks will almost certainly be a pair of Italian Marzoccis. But again, old school drum brakes on the front and the rear of this bike, because this is still the 1970s. And these levers and grips once again all look period correct for the bike, and the rear suspension system again was a pair of twin shocks that had these remote gas reservoirs fixed to the side of the chassis. But the entire bike here has been restored to a very high level, and unfortunately there wasn't a contact number on the information that was supplied with the bike. But for me personally, I still thought that the £3,750 asking price wasn't too much to pay for a fully restored and quite rare 1979 370 SWM. Now, there wasn't too many bargains to be had at the show this year, but I still thought that this SWM was going for a pretty fair price, considering it's had a full restoration. Now, one of the other bikes that I spotted at the show over the course of the 2 days was this quite nice looking 1983 Italian Cagiva 125 that belonged to Nigel Green. Now, if you were wandering around the show over the course of the 2 days, you more than likely may never have spotted this bike, because it was so tightly packed and hidden in between a few other different bikes that Nigel had sitting on his stand. But he was quite quick to oblige me when I asked if we could dig it out so we could get some decent pictures of the machine. Now, one of the first things I said to Nigel was, that looks like a nice Italian bike, Nigel. You don't see many of these little Cagivas going around these days. It must be quite a rare little bike. To which Nigel promptly replied, "Rare? Not at all," he says. "I've got at least another 30 of these Cagivas in my garage back home." So just like Felipe with his nice collection of SWMs, we've obviously now found the other godfather of these Italian Cagivas in Nigel Green. And so as we take a look at this 1983 125 Cagiva, you may see an uncanny resemblance to another Italian off-road manufacturer of the 1980s, the TGM 125. And when you take a look at this picture here of a 1981 TGM bike, it's almost identical, apart of course from the Italian-made Hyro engine, and that was all mainly because Cagiva then purchased the TGM company around the same time that this 1983 bike hit the showrooms. And in terms of the bike's overall looks, you just can't of course beat the Italians when it comes to designing these kind of motorcycles. And these little Cagivas were powered by this 125 liquid-cooled reed valve two-stroke motor, and this engine here looks like it's had a handmade replacement ignition cover at one time, but they were a tight and little compact motor, and that was quite zippy and pretty quick for such a small engine. And these Cagivas were extremely popular in the European countries in the 1980s, but I don't think many were actually seen racing on racetracks here in the UK. And as you'd expect for a 1983 motocrosser, they had modern style linkage type rear suspension, and they also had the familiar plastic fuel tank for the period, and also radiator shrouds there to deflect the oncoming air into the radiator to assist in its cooling. Although in terms of its performance, this little Cagiva power plant was quite revvy, and as long as you kept the engine in its mid-range sweet spot and danced up and down on that gearbox, you could still achieve some decent results if the track was tight and twisty. Although naturally, if the course did have long straights, then you'd most certainly just get eaten up by the bigger bikes with their superior horsepower. Now, this soft, damp rear suspension system was Cagiva's own brand name, just like Honda with their Pro Link or Yamaha with their monocross suspension system, and many of the bike's controls here on this machine would have more than likely have been manufactured by local Italian companies like Tomaselli. But once again, another nice little Italian stallion, and although I thought that at the time the bike was quite rare, Nigel didn't seem to share that same view, but then again Nigel would say that when he's got another 30 Cagivas in his workshop at home. But I still think it's a nice, reasonably rare bike, and it's just good to take a look at another one of these Italian Cagiva 125s once again. Okay, so our next feature here, if you're looking to maybe have your old bike plastic parts refurbished, then these guys here at Holab Concepts are the ones to get in touch with. And Keith Ree at Holab can of course take your old faded bike plastics and then make them look like new once again. Now, Keith, of course, as you know, is an ex-Kramer works rider from the past who now spends his time doing van conversions into camper vans, and he also restores classic motocross bikes, and I'm pretty sure that you've already seen some of Keith's restorations here on my YouTube channel. So his bike plastic refurbishing skills, as you'd expect, do come in very handy when he's restoring machines that he can no longer get original new plastics for. So maybe if you're in the middle of or are maybe about to start on the refurb or restoration of a classic motorcycle and you have the stock plastics but they do look a bit faded and worn out, then why not just give Keith a call or just message him on his Holab Facebook page, and I'm sure that he'll be able to help you out. And so as we move back to our machines from the Telford 2022 show, this was a nice little bike that was again offered for sale over the course of the 2 days, and this was a nice Triumph Serco Cub 250, and this particular bike here at one time belonged to the late Jimmy Allen, who of course was part of the famous Scottish motorcycling family of Robbie, Jimmy and the great Vic Allen. But personally speaking, I can still remember Jimmy using this bike at some of the Scottish Classic Motorcycle Club race events, and I'm also sure that Jimmy did a few trials meetings on this bike as well at one time. Now, once again, I don't know an awful lot about the actual motor, other than it's obviously a 200cc Triumph Tiger Cub that's been converted to a 250, but there may be another few upgrades or tuning that's been done to the motor, but I was never really supplied with every detail about the motor, but all of you Triumph experts out there will already have deciphered what you're looking at, so there's certainly no need for me to confuse the issue. But I can imagine that it would be a cracking little bike for using at classic scrambles or even some rock climbing trials events, and if you're maybe in the market and have about £4,950 lying around, then why not give John a ring on this number and see if he can do you a deal on the bike, because after all, this is no ordinary motorcycle, because this was Jimmy's number one go-to race bike when he was either taking part in scrambling or any other off-road motorcycle pursuits. Although there is one other plus point about this little bike, and I also know that this machine comes with an A4 folder that's absolutely full of documentation and details of any work that's been done on this bike since it was put together. So there's quite a bit of documentation with receipts and costs or any other mechanical work that's been carried out when Jimmy owned the bike. So in that respect, it's certainly not one of these bikes with some dubious past, because all of the bike's history is certainly written down in black and white. Although this is certainly a chance for some lucky person to own a piece of Scottish racing history, because the Allen racing family, as you know, are absolute legends north of the border, and when you remember that the great Robbie Allen raced in the grueling Paris-Dakar race on a Honda CRF 450 when he was actually 65, that'll maybe give you an insight into just the kind of commitment that the Allen family have for their motocross racing. Although certainly a nice little bike with plenty documentation and of course racing history as well. A nice Serco 250 Triumph. And so as we head towards the end of our visit to the 2022 Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show, we're going to leave the final few words to Frank Melling, whose brand new book, which is titled Scrambling for Enthusiastic Beginners, and how he survived the 1960s with a smile.
Good morning, Chris. It's lovely to see you here at the Classic Dirt Bike Show at Telford, and this is my new book, which I think you really like. You read lots of books about the 60s, and they're mainly written by people who weren't there, and the standard joke is if you weren't there, you could probably remember it, and if you were there, I don't know whether you can or not. And I was there, and I grew up in the 1960s, and I grew up racing and learning about racing. And I started off really at the bottom of the pile. Would you believe, on a 500 BSA B33, an iron barrel one. I went to my first meeting near Oswestry and failed in practice, crashed in the first race, crashed badly in the second race, and wrote off several marshals and a large lump of fence in the third race. Came home with the bike wrecked, exhausted, and loved motorcycle racing, and I was hooked from then on. And so it tells the stories of growing up with bikes in the 1960s, and then later on things changed for me, because I started to learn and work with and enjoy the company of some of the great superstars of the period. For example, I was able to call Eric Cheney, and I think he's the greatest artisan designer of his day. I was privileged to call him Uncle Eric, and I rode the factory Cheneys. I also knew Alan Clues from CCM really well, and he wasn't a Frank Melling fan, and Alan wasn't my best friend either, but we both respected each other. Alan respected the fact that I was going to tell my readers what I thought about bikes, and I respected the fact that Alan had real vision. He could have taken the bits from BSA, made 20 or 30 bikes out of them, had a quick earner, but he didn't. He had a bigger idea, and he kept a meticulous day book because he wanted CCM to be more than a specials builder. And I had a lot of time for that. And then the most incredible story in the book, I was BSA's last works rider. Can you believe an ordinary clubman rider ends up riding a factory BSA for one of the world's greatest motorcycle factories? I was writing columns in America, and they became very popular, and so I sort of became famous. That's not fair to me. I was becoming famous, and the BSA factory was getting letters from America saying you should meet this guy and you should talk to him. So I went down to BSA, met Lionel Joffe, the managing director, said that BSA were not serving their customers well. They needed more modern bikes, they needed electric start bikes, they needed all the things Honda were doing. And he basically said that I didn't understand that motorcycles were not motorcycles, they were units of production. And I said I did understand. So eventually, as a sort of kiss and make up agreement, Reg Dancer, the PR manager of BSA, had a factory BSA built for me, a full-blown factory BSA, identical to the one that had been winning the year before, and I was blown away. But it was a funny bike, it was a strange bike, because suddenly I was faced with the truth that all clubman racers face. Okay, you've got one of the best bikes in the world, it's there, it's prepared by the BSA factory. Now, it's at this point that the talking stops. Can you win on it, or can't you win on it? And I won a few races at club level, and I won a big grass track and things like that. But that bike convinced me I was going nowhere as a top quality rider. So we've got all those stories, along with some funny ones as well. What happens when you invite your girlfriend into an overhead crane and she becomes passionate as you're moving a large machine about? That's a nice story. And there's the stories of growing up in the 60s as it was, and where I came from and what I was doing. The book is £12.99, and it's available from www.frankmelling.co.uk. That's frankmelling.co.uk. We're very happy to sign books, and thank you for reading the book, which was #1 bestseller on Amazon, and we look forward to you hearing what you think about scrambling, because I am you and you are my customers. Thanks very much.
And so there you have it, over 2.5 hours of coverage, 5 separate videos, and just a very small sample of some of the nice machines that were on display at this year's Telford show. So once again, thanks for taking the time to watch my content, and of course for the many comments that you've been leaving on my videos. But don't forget to subscribe and return to my channel to see more old vintage dirt bikes right here on your number one and favourite Classic Dirt Bike TV.